Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to unravel a true story that is honestly almost impossible to believe. We're talking about a 17-year-old girl who plummeted 2 miles out of the sky and somehow conquered the Amazon rainforest. It's one of those wild stories that totally defies physics, challenges everything we think we know about human endurance, and really proves just how absolutely vital knowledge is when it comes to survival. Okay, let's just start with this number right here. 10,000. Let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of feet, nearly 3 kilometers, that Juliane Koepcke fell on Christmas Eve back in 1971. And get this, she did it completely without a parachute. To put that into perspective for you, she fell from a height where the wind is just howling, the air is freezing cold, and the ground below is literally a dense, unforgiving wilderness. That is a fall no human being is supposed to walk away from. No way. All right, part 1, the girl in the sky. To really understand how someone survives a drop from the stratosphere, we've got to start at the terrifying climax of her flight. That is the end. It's all over. You know, those were the actual chilling final words spoken by Maria Koepcke, who was sitting right beside her teenage daughter, Juliane. They were flying straight into a violently intense thunderstorm over the Peruvian rainforest. Daylight had completely turned to pitch black. Lightning was flashing from every direction. Luggage was flying out of the overhead bins. It was chaos. And then a bright flash of lightning struck the outer engine on the wing, pushing the plane way beyond its structural limits. In a split second, the aircraft just tore apart in midair. Her mom spoke those calm, haunting words, and then the deafening roar of the engines just vanished. Suddenly, Juliane was outside, in the open air, in total freefall. So I know what you're thinking. How on earth did she actually survive that? Well, experts believe it was this incredible 1 in a million combination of atmospheric physics and just pure luck that allowed her to wake up alive on the jungle floor. See, she was still strapped to a row of 3 seats, and as she fell, that row started spinning like a maple seed. It essentially acted like a giant helicopter rotor, providing crucial air resistance. On top of that, the powerful updrafts from that same violent thunderstorm were likely pushing up against her, slowing her descent even more. And finally, when she reached the ground, the thick, springy layers of the Amazon canopy acted like a giant cushion to absorb that final brutal impact. So yes, she miraculously survived an impossible descent, but the physical toll, it was absolutely devastating. When she wakes up on Christmas morning, she's still strapped to her seat. She's totally alone, wearing only a little sleeveless mini dress, and she's actually missing one of her sandals. She's got a severe concussion, a broken collarbone, this deep open laceration on her arm. One of her eyes is swollen completely shut, and she has a torn knee ligament. And crazily enough, she didn't even feel the knee injury right away because her body was just so flooded with adrenaline. So she's badly injured and trapped in a wilderness where, frankly, almost everything is trying to eat you. Which brings us to part 2, raised by the jungle. Now, if this had been you or me or honestly almost anyone else, the story would have tragically ended right there on the jungle floor. But Juliane had this massive psychological advantage. For the general public, the Amazon is a terrifying green hell, right? It's full of venomous predators and deadly pathogens. But for Juliane, she looked around and saw a familiar environment. Her mom was an ornithologist studying tropical birds, and her dad was a highly renowned zoologist. Because of her upbringing, she wasn't paralyzed by the fear of the unknown. She could actually recognize the croaks of the frogs, she knew the bird calls, and most importantly, she understood the rules of the ecosystem. Because get this, for a year and a half before the crash, Juliane was actually living with her parents at a biological research station deep in the jungle called Panguana. She considered herself a jungle child. She was literally homeschooled right there in the middle of the rainforest. So she had spent months absorbing all this vital life-saving knowledge, like which plants were safe to touch, why shallow waters were super dangerous, and just generally how the forest behaved. Her parents had basically taught her everything about the exact environment she was now lost in. Let's rewind a bit to part 3, Flight 508 into the storm. You might be wondering how she ended up on that doomed plane in the first place. Well, Juliane had just graduated high school in Lima, and her mom were desperate to get back to Panguana for Christmas. Her dad had specifically warned them, like, do not fly LANSA. The airline had an incredibly terrible safety record. In fact, the specific aircraft they boarded was literally pieced together entirely out of spare parts from other planes, but flights were totally booked packed up for the holidays, so it was their only option. Out of 92 people aboard that flight into the storm, Juliane would be the only one to walk out of the jungle. And that launches us into part 4, 11 days of survival. So she's completely alone, stripped of her plane, her mom, her glasses. She's practically half blind. She has to rely entirely on a piece of advice her father gave her. And the survival logic here is brilliant because it's so simple. If you find a small creek, follow it. It'll lead to a larger stream, which eventually dumps into a river, and human beings tend to live along rivers. She started wading directly through the water because the jungle undergrowth was just way too thick to walk through.
And remember how I mentioned she only had one sandal? Well, she cleverly used that single shoe to poke the muddy riverbed ahead of her to test for deadly stingrays before she even took a step. Pretty smart, right? Over the next 11 days, she endured a timeline that is just brutal. For food, she had absolutely nothing except a salvaged bag of candy from the wreckage and whatever raindrops she could lick off the leaves. She was fighting off profound exhaustion and the very real threat of hypothermia every single night. On day 4, she heard the horrifying calls of king vultures, which led her to a row of seats embedded in the earth, with 3 crash victims still strapped in. She actually had to use a stick to check their polished toenails just to make sure it wasn't her mother. And then she just kept moving. Now skip ahead to day 9, she finally stumbles upon a small boat and an abandoned logging hut. Inside, she hits the jackpot, a can of gasoline. And what she does next is easily one of the most harrowing moments of her entire ordeal. She takes that gasoline and pours it directly onto her badly infected arm to flush out flesh-eating botfly larvae. Yeah, she endured intense, unimaginable pain to pull over 30 maggots out of her own flesh. And she knew to do this because she remembered seeing her father do the exact same thing for their family dog. Alright, part 5, the river leads home. After going through unimaginable physical agony, starvation, and intense grief, her strict rule of following the river finally paid off. The very next morning, local Peruvian lumberjacks showed up at the hut. Now, initially, they were totally freaked out. They saw this dirty, pale, blonde girl emerging from the jungle, and they actually thought she was a mythological water goddess from local folklore. But Juliane pulled out another vital tool her parents gave her fluent Spanish. She just calmly introduced herself, explained she was a survivor of the LANSA crash, and secured her own rescue. After a long canoe ride downriver on day 11, she was finally brought back to civilization. Finally, part 6, Legacy of the Survivor. Now, returning to civilization meant medical care and a deeply emotional reunion with her father. But it also brought a really painful revelation. When investigators finally reached the crash site, they discovered a heartbreaking reality. 14, as many as 14 other passengers, including Juliane's own mother, actually survived the initial fall from the sky. They were alive down there on the jungle floor exactly like Juliane, but because of their injuries, they couldn't move, and they tragically perished while waiting for a rescue that simply never came in time. The heavy burden of survivor's guilt is something she would carry for the rest of her life. But here's the incredible thing about Juliane. Though she was haunted by the grief of being the sole survivor, she didn't run away from the jungle. She fully embraced her parents' legacy. She went on to earn a doctorate in biology, specializing as a mammologist studying bats. She even returned to take over as the director of that very same Pangwana research station. She has literally dedicated her entire life to protecting the exact rainforest that nearly killed her, but ultimately, through its tough lessons, saved her life. Juliane Koepcke's story proves that sometimes survival isn't just about sheer, inexplicable luck. It's really about the knowledge you carry with you. Her parents gave her the tools to read the forest instead of fearing it. And I think it leaves all of us wondering, if you fell 2 miles out of the sky right into the middle of the Amazon, would you know how to survive? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this incredible story stays with you as long as it's going to stay with me.